Now, some would say, all right, what about the question of other atonement outside of blood? I mean, we see the importance of sacrifice. We see what's written in 2 Chronicles 7. But even if a traditional Jew would say this, counter-missionary would say this, even if I accept your premise that blood sacrifices are of great importance in the Torah, the fact is that our Hebrew Bible, including the Torah itself, offers other means of atonement, not just the shedding of blood. Actually, there can be no question that the foundation of the entire atonement system is blood atonement. It is central and it is irreplaceable. You remove that and everything collapses. Even if you could argue that there were some secondary or tertiary forms of atonement, there were other things related to the atonement system, even if you could argue that, the fact of the matter is the center of it, the core of it, the nucleus of it all was blood atonement. You take that away, the whole thing collapses. It's even possible, and there's dispute over this, but it's even possible that some Talmudic texts say the same thing about atonement without blood. Now, I'll explain the dispute to you as we go a little further. Hebrews 9:22, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. That is an absolutely biblically true account. First, let's remember that when God saw the blood of the lamb, the sacrificial lamb in Exodus, that's when he said, I will pass over you when I see the blood. In Exodus 24, when a covenant is made with the people of Israel, and they said everything written in the book of the law will do, Moses then sprinkles sacrificial blood on the people and says, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. The Targum actually says this is the blood of atonement. Moses took the blood and poured it on the altar as atonement for the people. So in Exodus, the Passover, when I see the blood, I'll pass over you. The ratifying of the covenant comes with blood. So why was blood applied to the priests when they were installed? They're now going to be serving in the ministry of atonement, you could say. Priests in the altar were directly involved for providing atonement for Israel. Therefore, both were consecrated with blood. And blood provided purification and purgation for both the priests and the altar. Well, we could go through Exodus and see example after example of the importance of blood atonement. And the Torah consistently speaking about blood doesn't speak about prayer and atonement, doesn't speak about good deeds and atonement, doesn't speak about fasting and atonement, doesn't even speak about repentance and atonement in terms of those words explicitly spelled out, but blood, 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 blood. Why? Because atonement rites are intimately connected to the blood. So let's bottom line this even more if we can, all right? The center of the atonement system in Israel was the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, in rabbinic literature, Yoma, the day. That was the center. That was considered the holiest day of the year in Jewish tradition. And this is at the center of the entire atonement system, the Day of Atonement. And at the center of that day were blood sacrifices. And it was blood that was used to purge the tabernacle from the uncleanness that it would receive dwelling in the midst of the people of Israel. And it was blood that was used in animal sacrifices. And then another animal would vicariously carry the sins of the people out into the wilderness. And by later rabbinic times would actually be thrust off a mountain and killed. Sacrifices. Substitution. Life for life. Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11. It says this, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. The life of a creature is in the blood. And I've given it to you to make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. And again, as Rashi explains, for every creature is dependent on blood. Therefore, I have given it to you on the altar to atone for the life of man. Let life come and atone for the life. According to Chief Rabbi Hertz, the late former chief rabbi of the British Empire, the UK. He said this on Leviticus 17:11, the use of blood, representing life and the rites of atonement, symbolized the complete yielding up of the worshiper's life to God and conveyed the thought that the surrender of a man to the will of God carried with it the assurance of divine pardon. Life for life. So, does the Talmud verify this? Well, there's dispute. The Talmud, speaking of the various aspects of the sacrificial system in several different texts, does this part atone, does this part atone? In other words, within the sacrificial system, what actually makes atonement? And the rabbinic conclusion is, Halo in kapara ela badam. Isn't it true that there's no atonement without the blood? Surely there's no atonement without the blood. Now, in context, it seems to be saying that within animal sacrifices, what is the thing that actually brings the atonement? What part of the process? It's the blood. There are, however, Jewish scholars that say that this was actually a cultic maxim, a temple concept, a ritual concept. There is no atonement without the blood. And that the rabbis also recognize the centrality of blood atonement. That can be debated, and I'll let that debate happen between different Jewish scholars. I cite them in volume 2 of Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus. 1 Chronicles 6, 48 and 49, or in other translations, 33 and 34. The Levites were assigned to all the other duties of the tabernacle, the house of God, but Aaron and his descendants were the ones who presented offerings on the altar of burnt offering and on the altar of incense in connection with all that was done in the most holy place, making atonement for Israel in accordance with all that Moses, the servant of God, had commanded. It's hard to argue that while the temple was standing, blood sacrifices were viewed as the principal and irreplaceable means of atonement. Look at what Professor Ephraim Urbach said, one of the leading scholars of rabbinic literature. The doctrine of Rabbi Ishmael, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi, that death, even death without repentance, has the power to atone, originated only after the destruction of the temple. For with regard to the temple period, it is stated, and for all other prohibitions ordained in the Torah, be they light or grave, premature death, and execution by the court, the scapegoat makes atonement. At the time when the temple still stood, it was certainly unnecessary and appropriate to regard death as an atonement. In other words, you have the animal sacrifices. You don't have to say, well, my death serves as an atonement, because you have the animal sacrifices to take the place. Urbach says this, the fasts that multiplied after the destruction also assumed the character of a surrogate and replacement for the atonement effected by the sacrifices. Even to the point that rabbinic prayer was developed to say, well, instead of sacrifices, we diminish our own flesh. We fast and diminish our own flesh because we can't offer up sacrifices. So I could go on and demonstrate the central importance of the blood, the foundational importance of the blood in sacrifices. The question would be, but aren't there some texts that speak about like flour atoning or incense atoning or money atoning? Aren't there some texts? Well, let's look at them. Leviticus 5 says if an Israelite is too poor to bring a ram or lamb or offering like that, lamb, goat, turtle dove, pigeon, you can bring an offering of fine flour. So it says this, if, however, he cannot afford 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, he is to bring as an offering for sin 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour for a sin offering. He must not put oil or incense on it because it is a sin offering. He is to bring it to the priest, who shall take a handful of it as a memorial portion and burn it on the altar on top of the offerings made to the Lord by fire as a sin offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement for him for any of these sins he has committed, and he will be forgiven. The rest of the offering will belong to the priest, as in the case of the grain offering. Well, there you have it. You don't need the blood. Flour. Hang on. What do? You take the flour and it is put on the blood sacrifices that are on the altar. In other words, this is the poor person's way of participating in the atonement system, that he takes what he has and he takes the flour and it is mingled with the blood sacrifices. So I have a question for you. Was there any hint that you could just offer flour aside from the altar and the sacrifices? No. When the children of Israel were in exile, did they say, well, we have flour, we can... No. It was only when joined with the blood sacrifices on the altar. Nowhere does it say that the flour makes atonement. Nowhere are they eager to, well, if we could just offer flour, you could offer flour anywhere. No, you couldn't. It had to be joined with the blood sacrifices if it was going to be effective. Flour in itself has no atoning power. This was just the way for the poor Israelite to join in. This would become a sin offering for that person, and they would join in with the atonement system. You say, yeah, but what about Exodus 30? When you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life. That's related. Kofar, atonement, ransom. At the time he's counted, then no plague will come on them when you number them. It speaks of a specific amount of money, a half shekel offering. The rich are not to give more than a half shekel, and the poor are not to give less when you make the offering to the Lord to atone for your lives. Receive the atonement money from the Israelites. You have this in Exodus 30, and then you have a similar account in Numbers 31. After a census is taken, the Israelites then take silver and gold that they had and offer it up so that there's no plague. Actually, this is not teaching that money makes atonement. And can I ask you a question? Have you ever heard that in Jewish literature, the money makes atonement? Can you imagine God saying, well, just pay me. The money makes atonement? No. It's possible, and some rabbinic commentaries think this way, it's possible that it is referring to atonement money. And the reason it's referring to atonement money is because it went towards the maintenance of the tabernacle or the temple. In other words, it tied in with the support of the atonement system in the temple, the blood sacrifices and the priestly ministry and all of that. So you gave towards that. That was your participation in it. Possible. That's possible. But more likely, it's not referring to atonement at all. The Hebrew lichaper can mean to make atonement. It can mean to expiate. It can mean to purge. It can also have the nuance of averting wrath. Averting wrath. And you see, the Israelites endangered themselves. For reasons the biblical text doesn't tell us exactly, the Israelites endangered themselves when they took a census. And because of that, when they counted the number of people, they needed to take ransom money to avert the plague. And they would take this and give it over to the temple service so as to avert the plague. And there are many Jewish teachers that hold to that. According to Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir Rashbam, the respected son of Rashi, he said this, stating in his widely used Torah commentary that the words often translated here as atonement money derive their meaning from the fact that the money served as a ransom, both kofar, for their lives. So rather than meaning to make atonement, it meant to pay a ransom. And Rashi says this in Exodus 30, that this means so that you will not be smitten with a plague because of the census. So in all likelihood, doesn't even refer to atonement. And if it did refer to atonement, it would be because payments being made to the temple system. Nowhere is there even a hint of a text where you gave money. Okay, I sinned, here's money for atonement. God forbid. What about number 16, where there's a plague that breaks out among the people, and Aaron is told by Moses, take your censer, put incense in it along with fire from the altar, hurry to the assembly to make atonement for them. Wrath has come out from the Lord. So Aaron does this, and he stands between the living and the dead with his incense burning, and the plague stops. Professor Jacob Milgrom, one of the world's foremost authorities on the book of Leviticus, says that the verb kippur here, usually translated to make atonement or expiation, in this context carries the connotation of make appeasement. saying that incense served to appease and soothe divine wrath in the ancient Near East. In other words, it's got nothing to do with atonement for sin. It's again appeasing wrath. This incense is turning away wrath, just like the ransom money that was paid, the temple tax, the tabernacle tax. But not only so, notice that he's got to get fire from the altar. Don't just light up your censer, but go to the altar, get fire from the altar. When you get fire from the altar, then you have this. Why? Because the altar was the place of atonement. So if it does tie in with atonement, it ties back to the altar where the blood sacrifices were offered. And at most, the very most, that the Talmud and rabbinic commentaries make out of this is that incense could atone for gossip. In other words, there's never been a teaching. There's never been a teaching. Well, if we don't have blood sacrifices, we can always offer up incense. Let's just burn incense in the room and we'll get forgiven. No. Not a hint of that in Jewish law, in Jewish tradition. So to say there are other means of atonement, that's completely misleading. Nowhere could it take the place of the sacrificial system. This is talking about driving away wrath in terms of God's anger. You say, yeah, but aren't there scriptures outside of the Torah that talk about atonement being made without any reference to blood sacrifice? Well, actually, there are some verses in the prophetic texts, like Isaiah chapter 27, which says this, and I'll read this to you in a Christian translation. Assuredly by this alone shall Jacob's sin be atoned for, and this will be the full fruitage of the removal of his sin, when he makes all the altar stones to be like chalk stones crushed to pieces. No Asherah poles or incense altars will be left standing. And it's that root lichaper, to atone for. But you know what's interesting? The New Jewish Version doesn't understand it to speak of atonement, but rather removal, purging. By this alone shall Jacob's sin be purged away. This is the only price for removing his guilt. It's not a matter of how to receive forgiveness. It's a matter of how to remove guilt, how to remove pollution, how to remove sinful practices. You destroy the idols. You get rid of the altars. Listen, they're flip sides of the same coin, but the blood was the means of forgiveness and atonement, and the repentance was the means of putting away that which was wrong. So it's the New Jewish Version that says that. Same in Isaiah, the 6th chapter. The New Jewish Version understands when the coal is put to the prophet's lips, it doesn't atone for his sin. And by the way, even if it did in this vision, it's still coals from the divine altar, yes? The place of atonement, the altar of atonement. Rather, the New Jewish Version understands it the same way. Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt shall depart and your sin be purged away. It's a burning away of the sin as opposed to the atonement. Again, flip sides of the same coin. So even when we look ahead to a third temple, this is a question that comes up for us as Jewish followers of Yeshua. It seems that at a future third temple, there'll be sacrifices again. We'll take that up later. But the point I want to make is that traditional Judaism, which claims that there are other means for atonement outside of the physical temple and the blood sacrifices, is earnestly praying for the day when the temple will be rebuilt and sacrifices offered again. And interestingly, speaking with one counter-missionary rabbi, I said to him, can there be full national atonement for Israel without a temple standing? Because something is fundamentally wrong if the temple is not standing and sacrifices are being offered according to the Hebrew Scriptures. Can there be full national atonement without the temple, without the sacrifices? And he said, no, something is missing. We can get individual atonement, but on a national level, something is missing. Oh, I would say to him, sir, you are so near and yet so far. You can't get individual atonement either without the blood. The good news is we have the blood of Messiah. You say, but we don't believe in human sacrifice. That's where we'll go in the next lecture.